15.
Yeah, I'm going to read it all. I'm very glad to be here, and what I'm going to talk about is an extraordinary phenomenon. And it's the phenomenon of a country like ours, which loves its history, as we saw the other day at Westminster Abbey, which wants to know more and more about its past, which even when it plants gardens, wants the history of the garden to go forward and to be a deep part of it. And yet what we've done in the last 50 or 60 years, for reasons to do with secularization, indifference, and to do with what I'd call a militant atheism sometimes, is to airbrush, to wipe out one of the most important strands, not only in the history of this country, but in the history of the English-speaking world. It's a big claim. But in 15 minutes, I'd like to give a few identifiable reasons why I'm making that claim. I call my book the Book of Books. That's because the Bible has often been called the Book of Books. It has 66 books in it. It had 80 in it when it was originally published. It had the Apocrypha in it, the so-called naughty books. It's a pity they were cut out, especially because of women. It had the apocryphal Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which puts her in a very different light from that in which she's been put by interpreters ever since. I'm going to talk about the impact of it across our society. Because a society that loses its history, and that deliberately loses its history, staggers to the future lame, and I think that maybe we're suffering from that loss at the moment. It began about 700 or 800 years ago with a massive struggle for extraordinarily brave people, many of whom were martyred, they were burnt, they were young men mainly, almost all young men, at the stuffy universities, so-called privileged places of Oxford and Cambridge in the Middle Ages, who were absolutely determined that their own countrymen would read the Bible in their own language. They didn't want to change the faith. They were devout Roman Catholics. They believed in everything that came from Rome, but they wanted the book to be read in English. English had been a great language before the Middle Ages, one of the few languages in Europe which is both written and spoken, already rich, until the Norman French came with William the Conqueror, and more or less attempted with a great deal of success for a while to eliminate it. In 1066, the first king to be crowned in Westminster Abbey, Harold Godwinson, was crowned at a ceremony which was in English. Usually in other countries, these were done in Latin. It was in English. They were so proud of their language. The Normans came in 1066, a bit later than his coronation, and it took 333 years before another king was crowned in the same abbey, in the same language. But by the end of that time, by the end of the 14th century, all over the place, people were bringing English back. The father of our literature, Chaucer, was writing in English. John Wycliffe and his Oxford scholars were translating the Bible into English, and they were murdered for it. They were murdered for it. They were pursued through the land. They went through the highways and byways. Oxford colleges were turned into places where these young men transcribed it and put their manuscripts under long cloaks. They wore long cloaks. They were called lollards. Went through the country and brought this to the people of England. They had an ideal, and their ideal was that the ploughboy, they always used the notion of the ploughboy, because he was close to the earth, because he was illiterate. It mattered that the Bible would be heard in its own language by people who didn't speak or didn't understand Latin. Latin had a complete grip on the Bible. It had a grip on the law. It was one of the great instruments of power, both of the state and the church, from the time that Christianity became a Roman religion in the 4th century until it was broken. And it was really broken by English men who were determined to get this book into their own language. And the greatest of them was William Tyndale, an absolutely phenomenal scholar who in the 1620s was exiled. He was eventually pursued, strangled, of course, burnt at the stake. But by then, he translated the New Testament into a fantastic English, and as much of the Old Testament as he could do before he was caught and effectively murdered. And he, with Shakespeare, have formed our language. Much of the language that you're speaking tonight and will speak tomorrow and spoke today comes from Tyndall. Phrases galore. If I may refer to this for a second. Well, little sentences. Let there be light, fell flat in his face. Let my people go, the apple of his eye, a man after his own heart, signs of the times, under the sun, to rise and shine, the land of the living, landlady, beautiful, heartbreaking, breathtaking, all and hundreds more in Tyndall, and still in our language, and still bringing images and feelings to us. He set that tone. And he set the idea of English being a most profound and complicated language by the use of monosyllables. Words with one sound, one beat. The Word was God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and life was the light of man, to be or not to be, taken up by Shakespeare, the great monosyllabic beat in English speech and in English talk. We're going for polysyllables as well, but it's that monosyllabic bass, and it was there in Tyndall. And Tyndall influenced Shakespeare. I know one or two reviewers have said Tyndall's, the King James Bible came out in 1611, Shakespeare died in 1615, how could Tyndall influence Shakespeare? I didn't say that. I said Tyndall influenced Shakespeare because Shakespeare heard and took notice of and lived with the Bible that became the King James Bible. After Tyndall's death, there were book after book in the English language, and most of them took masses of Tyndall without acknowledgement, including the King James Bible. And the great Bible at the time of Shakespeare was called the Geneva Bible. It was cheap, it was full of marginal notes, and he would have heard that every day in his church, and he would have heard that every day in his school. And he took from that, he refers to 42 different books in the Bible. He mentions Cain and Abel 25 times, Judas 25 times, and some of his specific images are to do with that Bible. For instance, I'll just give you a couple, if I can find them. This is a bit of a hold-up, but I do think it's important. So there you go. Tyndall in the Geneva Bible, his New Testament is over 85% from Tyndall. In the King James Bible, it's over 82% from Tyndall. They're virtually the same Bible. And for instance, in Shakespeare, you have in Matthew, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father. And in Hamlet, there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. And in Corinthians it says, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, the eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was, and on it goes. And then the flow begins, from Tyndall to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare to Donne, and through to many of the great writers, through George Eliot, through the Bronte sisters, through Dryden, through Defoe, the supposed founder of the English novel. On it goes up to the present day in America with Toni Morrison. There's Harriet Beecher Stowe, there's Hawthorne, there's Melville in Moby Dick, there's Cormac McCarthy still. In it goes, phrase after phrase, and the rhythm and the beat. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they shall see God. That deep, big, deep beat. So it's not only with the rhythms, they came from the Bible. So at the very least, and it's a big least, that is one impact over 400 years, which still goes through. But I think that, in a sense, is the easy bit, and that's just the beginning of it. Because what I set out to prove is that right across our society, this has such a huge impact. And the beginnings of modern science, in our attitudes to sex, in the professionalization and the empowerment of women in the 19th and 20th century, in education, and in the most remote areas that you would not think it did have, and I'll pick out 2 or 3 of them. Let's take slavery, which was one of the astounding things for me. The King James Bible worked the argument for slavery in 3 ways, the same Bible. Those people who believed in slavery found plenty of justification in the Bible. There are lush contradictions, lush ambiguities. That's what makes great work sometimes. You can find one hand and the other hand meshed in the same thing. They found examples of slaves all over the Bible, and they used it. And they also said, with truth, that every civilization that had ever made a note or a record of itself had slaves. That slaves was the natural order of things, and God said so also in the Bible. That's in King James Bible. Because the argument was conducted around the King James Bible. We're talking about the late 17th, early 18th century. Then the abolitionists came up. Let's take Wilberforce in this country as one of the leading figures. He had a revelation. He was a very, very, very rich young man, a friend of the then Prime Minister, spoilt and so on, hedonist, gambling, all the rest of it. And he had a revelation. And his revelation was that he should follow God and do something good in the world. The second thing was more important than the first. He put his fortune and his energies into the abolition of the slave trade. And he read the Bible every day. And his arguments came from the Bible. His arguments for the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery itself came from the Bible. So both sides are using the same book to argue on the one great cause. It's a fantastic thing, the abolition of slavery. It was the worst thing that America did to employ it. It's the best thing they've ever done to get rid of it, and we were part of that. We were a great part of that in this country. So they're at each other with the same book, using quotes that are often very much the same. And then the slaves themselves. This is the phenomenal thing. The slaves themselves on the plantations were often allowed into the back of the churches. And they built their own wooden churches. I've been there. And they're just great. And this is where the Speaker's Bible came in. Because Tyndall, especially, wrote a Bible to be spoken. It was a preacher's Bible. Even when they put the King James Bible together in 1611, or 50 scholars for over 7 years, they didn't write it and send it to each other. They spoke it to each other. Before they wrote it down, they spoke it all the time. They wanted it to reach out. So these men and women in the back of these churches were hearing the Bible, and they were very clever people, and they were remembering it. Now, the Bible did 2 things, the King James Bible, because these are massively different tribes coming from West Africa with different and complicated languages, with its multitude of intricate languages that Africa had, and they got one language came through the Bible. That is how they formed a common language. They had their own languages as well, but a common language. And secondly, the examples of the Bible was a liberation theology. They could see that in the Bible, Moses had said, I told Pharaoh, let my people go. And he'd led the Israelites out of slavery. And they used, let my people go. And the songs came, and the gospels came, and the singing came, and the spirituals came. They found relevance for it in the Bible. They knew it. They heard it because they'd memorized this preaching Bible, and they preached. It's a tribute again to this country. That it was again Oxford scholars, Wesleyans like John Wesley and George Whitefield, who preached in America. And they were the first people, first white preachers to go into these communities and speak. And they then they had their own Baptist preachers, their own Methodist preachers. And it took off. It's one of the blights on Richard Dawkins' book, some of which is very sensible. One of the blights that he says that Bible was used often as a sop and a consolation to keep people quiet. Look how it subdued the slaves in America so the bosses could do what they want with them. He is absolutely wrong. He's so wrong, it's disgraceful. In any of his own work as a zoologist, of which he's a preeminent zoologist, or a thinker about biology, or a Darwinian, all of which he's very good at, he would never propose a sweeping generalization like that without testing it. And if he tested it, he'd have found it was completely wrong, like many other of his remarks about religion, dismissive remarks. They were not a sop. They knew what they were doing. And out of extraordinary pain, through the Bible, they reformed their language, which is an extraordinary feat. And then they used it both for its religious, for its faith, because it was a great spreader of faith, but for its politics. Swing low, sweet chariot was referring to the path that they took to get out of the south and cross the river into the freer north, and so on. So you had these three things going on in the one Bible. It's exhilarating. And so it goes on. It's used again and again by people who know that history is something that feeds the present. And if we don't know history, we don't know anything, really. You can't start again. Starting again's for kids. And one of the figures in the Bible is a woman called Hagar, who was the slave of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the founder of the three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Sarah could not have children, as you know. And so she said to Abraham, you have a child with Hagar, so that your seed will continue. And he did, with her slave. And Sarah was extremely jealous, but this young boy, Ishmael, was there. And then Sarah conceived, and she had a child. And she chucked out Hagar into the desert with the child, with just a few provisions, sentencing her to death. And from then on, in all the theologies from great theologians, Aquinas, Wycliffe, and so on, Hagar was a terrible woman. She was the condemned. Sarah was the wife of the founder of the religion. She was a sublime person. But the American feminists, the Afro-American feminists over the last 20 or 30 years have turned the story on its head. They've used Hagar as a great example of a survivor, of somebody who came through. And that's just a tiny example of the way that the stories are twisted and turned and reasserted and refresh and replenish what we are doing now. The authority of the Bible, the story of Hagar, is very important, not in mythology, but in contemporary social politics in America. 1 minute. All right. You can talk about it as being part of the instigation of modern science, which might surprise you, but it's there. And finally, democracy. The democratic seed in the English-speaking world began in this country, over there, and the trial of a king in the Great Hall at Westminster, trial by law, trial of king, and the execution of a king after a trial by law. It had never happened before in world history, and he was tried through the Bible. They didn't want to say kill the king. They used the Bible to say this is what God did to bad kings, and Charles I used the Bible to defend himself. He was tried and found guilty through the Bible. And after that great victory for what they saw as democracy through the Bible and the Putney debates, the idea of spreading the notion that they had two things now. They had their own language in which they could talk to God and challenge him. And God mattered then much more than it matters to most of us now. But secondly, they could execute a king, a divinely appointed king. And after that, they could do anything, even rule the state, even have votes for women, even be true Democrats. And that was seeded in this book. Thank you.